There's a moment in this press conference where Karoline Leavitt gets trapped, not by the press, but by Stephen Miller. When asked whether he would apologize, she can't answer. Not yes, not no. And that hesitation exposes a deeper problem inside the White House, one they can't spin their way out of.
On Stephen Miller's comments, will Stephen Miller be apologising to the family of Alex Pritty for calling him, quotes, an assassin who tried to murder federal agents, despite the fact that, as you say, this is still under investigation?
Look, again, this incident remains under investigation, and nobody here at the White House, including the President of the United States, wants to see Americans hurt or killed and losing their lives in American streets. And we mourn for the parents. As a mother myself, of course, I cannot imagine the loss of life, especially losing one's child. And that same empathy from the President goes for the parents of angel families, parents of victims of illegal alien crime across our country as well. And that's exactly why the President continues to be wholeheartedly committed to deporting the worst of the worst criminals from our country. Why don't we go to the back? Kelly.
Caroline, does the President believe that the killing, though, was a mistake? Has he expressed that at all?
Again, the President has said, we have to review it, and this investigation needs to continue, and he's letting the facts on the investigation lead itself.
Does he want body camera footage to be released to the public? Now,
that's not something I've heard the President commit to, so I won't do that from the podium. Sure.
Caroline, how serious is the administration taking allegations that local and state officials in Minnesota are actively coordinating with demonstrators through encrypted or non-encrypted communications, as well as providing government resources to impede immigration enforcement operations?
I'm sorry, Carrie, could you repeat your question?
How serious is the administration taking allegations that local and state Minnesota officials are communicating with demonstrators to basically impede immigration officials?
Well, we've definitely seen active organization amongst these left-wing groups, Carrie, and it is something that I know the FBI and the Department of Justice are looking into. Again, it is illegal to unlawfully obstruct lawful immigration enforcement in this country, and these agitators are making it nearly impossible for ICE to do their jobs and for federal law enforcement to carry out the will of the American people to deport the worst of the worst. I would just encourage everyone to please imagine in this room, all of you come to the White House every day to report on the President of the United States and the administration. You come into this briefing room, you walk through the gates of the White House. Just imagine if there were left-wing agitators or agitators of any kind who were in your face, who were doxing you, who were harassing you, who were physically threatening you, who were biting off your fingers. In the case of two Border Patrol agents we saw this past weekend in Minneapolis, that would make it very difficult for you to show up and do your job here at the White House every single day. That's what these officers in Minneapolis are facing. That's why the President is calling on Governor Walz and Mayor Frey for these three very simple and common sense points of cooperation so that ICE and local law enforcement can work together. Again, we are just asking for police to be police. And if you ask any law enforcement agent or official, they want to be able to work with their federal counterparts at the state and local level and vice versa.
Caroline.
Thanks a lot, Caroline. Two questions. One is looking forward. The role of Mr. Homan. Is he being sent by the President to diffuse the situation that exists right now on the ground? Is he the point person essentially for the White House in terms of trying to tamp down the tensions that exist right now in Minnesota?
Well, Mr. Homan is the point person for cooperating with state and local authorities and corresponding with them, again, to achieve this level of cooperation to subdue the chaos on the streets of Minneapolis. And I would just point out that Mr. Homan is someone who has been lauded for many, many decades for his experience working in law enforcement. In fact, this is a Washington Post headline from 9 years ago, 2016. Meet the man the White House has honored for deporting illegal immigrants. And I would remind everyone in this room that it was former President Barack Hussein Obama who awarded a medal to Mr. Homan. So he's obviously very qualified. He has the full trust and faith of the President. He will continue to have these meetings in the hopes that ICE and local law enforcement can cooperate and work together to have successful immigration enforcement, as we've seen in almost every other state across the country.
If you want to understand what actually went wrong in that White House briefing, don't focus on the shouting or the talking points or even the tragedy itself. Focus on the pause. That moment where Karoline Leavitt is asked a very simple question whether Stephen Miller will apologize, and suddenly the entire White House communication strategy collapses into dead air and verbal filler. Because that pause, that wasn't confusion, that was conflict. What we watched in real time was Karoline Leavitt running headfirst into Stephen Miller's mess and realizing on camera that she couldn't clean it up. Here's the thing, the reporter didn't ask about policy, they didn't ask about immigration philosophy, they didn't even ask about legality, they asked about basic human accountability. Will Stephen Miller apologize for calling a man an assassin while the investigation is still ongoing? Yes or no? And Leavitt couldn't answer it, not because the question was unfair, not because it was complicated, but because Stephen Miller had already gone too far and she knew it. So what does she do? She reaches for the oldest trick in the political handbook, emotional substitution. Suddenly, it's not about Miller's words anymore. It's about mourning. It's about being a mother. It's about empathy. And then almost impressively fast, it becomes about angel families and undocumented immigrants and deportations. That pivot wasn't accidental. That pivot was panic. Because Stephen Miller doesn't leave room for cleanup. He doesn't leave room for nuance. His entire brand is maximalist moral certainty. He doesn't imply, he declares. He doesn't hedge, he labels. And once he's done that, everyone else has to either back him completely or pretend he never spoke. Karoline Leavitt tried to do something in between, and that's where the trouble started. Watch the exchange carefully. She never says Miller was wrong. She never says he was right. She just steps around him like a spokesperson tiptoeing around a political landmine someone else planted and already detonated. And the press knows it. You can hear it in the follow-up questions. Does the president believe the killing was a mistake? Another yes or no question, another moment where Leavitt can't commit. Because if she says yes, she undermines Miller's certainty. If she says no, she owns the fallout. So instead, she hides behind the investigation. Now, let's be clear. Investigations are important. But in this room, the investigation is not a process, it's a shield. It's a way to avoid moral judgment while still letting the original accusation hang in the air, uncorrected. Stephen Miller got to say what he wanted. Karoline Leavitt got to say nothing. That's not unity, that's dysfunction. And it gets worse when the conversation shifts to Minnesota, because suddenly Leavitt isn't just defending the administration, she's prosecuting an entire state. Allegations become assumptions. Assumptions become facts. Active organization, she says, as if that phrase alone replaces evidence. Notice how the burden of proof magically flips. When it comes to Miller's words, we must wait. When it comes to local officials, we've definitely seen enough. That's not consistency. That's narrative triage. And then comes the most revealing moment of all, the imagined role play. Leavitt asks reporters to imagine being harassed, doxxed, threatened. It's a clever move emotionally, but it also gives the game away. Because when a spokesperson has to ask journalists to imagine a different reality, it usually means the reality on the ground isn't cooperating with the story being told. At this point, Stephen Miller is nowhere to be found, but his shadow is everywhere. Leavitt is doing the cleanup work of someone who doesn't believe in cleanup. She's trying to sound measured while defending a man whose entire political strategy depends on sounding uncompromising. She's trying to restore credibility while protecting rhetoric that actively destroys it. That's the conflict. Not personal animosity, structural incompatibility. Stephen Miller thrives on escalation. Karoline Leavitt is tasked with de-escalation. And you cannot do both at the same time. When Tom Homan enters the conversation, the contradiction becomes even sharper. He's framed as the professional, the stabilizer, the adult in the room, which raises the obvious question, if everything was already under control, why bring in a stabilizer at all? Leavitt insists there was no mistake, no misstep, no need to tamp down anything, but the language betrays her. Subdue the chaos, restore cooperation. These are not words you use when things are fine. They are words you use when the house is already on fire, and you're hoping no one smells smoke. And here's the satirical irony of it all. Stephen Miller never had to answer a single question. He never had to clarify. He never had to apologize. His words detonated, and Karoline Leavitt was left holding the debris, trying to arrange it into something that still resembled a coherent message. That's not strength. That's asymmetry. One side gets to speak freely. The other has to explain why speaking freely didn't mean what it sounded like. By the end of the exchange, you can feel it. The room isn't convinced. The press isn't satisfied. And Leavitt, for all her discipline, is visibly boxed in, not by hostile reporters, but by the impossible task she's been given: defend the indefensible without ever admitting it was indefensible. That's the real story here. Not Minnesota, not the investigation, not even immigration. The story is what happens when a political operation prioritizes ideological aggression over communicative coherence and then asks its spokesperson to make it look reasonable after the fact. Stephen Miller speaks like consequences don't exist. Karoline Leavitt speaks like she's drowning in them, and that's why this exchange matters, because for a brief moment, the mask slipped, and we saw the internal contradiction laid bare not through shouting or scandal, but through hesitation. And in politics, hesitation is often the loudest confession of all.